I've always believed that the people who live closest to you are the ones you should trust the most. After all, they're right there, within shouting distance if anything ever happens. You'd think neighbors are supposed to be the first line of help in case of trouble. That belief is what almost got me killed. When I moved into that apartment complex 3 years ago, I wasn't expecting much. It was cheap, old, and had the kind of faint, musty smell you can't ever get rid of, no matter how many candles or sprays you use. But for me, it was perfect. I was 23, fresh out of college, trying to save money, and just needed a place where I could be left alone. The first few days were uneventful until I met the man who lived directly next door. His name was Jerry, middle-aged, maybe late 40s, thinning brown hair, a slightly hunched posture, and the kind of smile you can't quite trust. It was too wide, too rehearsed, like he had practiced it in the mirror. But despite that, he seemed friendly. In fact, he was almost too friendly. "Hey there, new neighbor," he said the first time we met. He was holding a mug of coffee, standing in the hallway as if he'd been waiting for me to leave my apartment. "Name's Jerry. If you need anything, sugar, tools, or just a chat, you know where to knock." I smiled politely, thanked him, and we exchanged numbers. At first, I thought he was just one of those lonely guys who liked having company. Nothing wrong with that, but there was something about the way he looked at me, like he was studying me, memorizing every little detail. It put me on edge, though I pushed the feeling aside. The first couple of weeks, Jerry would accidentally bump into me a lot, in the hallway, by the laundry room, even once at the grocery store, which was a good 15 minutes away from the apartments. "Small world," he chuckled when I ran into him by the frozen foods section. He grabbed a pack of ground beef, looked at me, and said, "We should cook sometime. You come over, I'll make dinner. Or better yet, I'll cook for both of us." I laughed nervously and said maybe sometime. But in my gut, I knew I didn't want to. That's when little things started going missing in my apartment. A shirt, a set of keys, once a pack of ramen I was sure I had just bought. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. But then, I noticed something I couldn't explain away. I had a small bookshelf in my living room. One night I came home from work, and I swear the books were slightly rearranged. Not a lot, just enough for me to notice. The Stephen King novel that was supposed to be on the left was now on the right. The dust on the top shelf had a finger trail through it. It freaked me out so much that I installed a cheap door camera. Nothing fancy, just enough to see if someone was coming into my apartment. For a few days, nothing happened. But then one night, I checked the footage and felt my stomach drop. At 2:17 a.m., my door opened, and Jerry walked in. He wasn't in a hurry either. He stepped inside calmly, like he owned the place, looked around, and then walked toward the kitchen. He opened my fridge, took out a soda, cracked it open, and drank it while strolling through my living room. He sat on my couch for a few minutes, staring at the walls, before finally leaving. I wanted to call the cops right then and there, but I was terrified. What if they didn't believe me? What if Jerry found out I reported him? He lived right next door, and worst of all, I didn't know how many times he had already been inside before I caught him. I changed my locks the next day, spent a ridiculous amount of money I didn't really have, just for peace of mind. But when I told Jerry casually that I had lost my keys and had to get the locks changed, his face twitched ever so slightly. His smile faltered for just a second. "Oh," he said with a little chuckle. "Accidents happen. You know, keys are easy to lose." That night, I barely slept. A week later, something even worse happened. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound coming from the shared wall between our apartments. A low, rhythmic thump. At first, I thought it was him hammering something, but it was the middle of the night. The sound went on for a while, then stopped. Then came again. Thump, thump, thump. I pressed my ear against the wall, and I swear I could hear faint muffled noises, like someone crying. I told myself I was imagining it. But 2 days later, while leaving for work, I noticed something in the hallway. A small dark stain on the carpet, right in front of Jerry's door. It looked like someone had tried to clean it, but hadn't done a very good job. It was brownish red, dried blood. That's when I finally called the police. I told them I suspected my neighbor was breaking into my apartment and that I had footage. They came, looked at the video, and agreed it was enough to at least question him. When they knocked on Jerry's door, he answered immediately, smiling as always, acting like nothing was wrong. They talked to him for a while, then left, saying they'd look into it. But I could tell Jerry wasn't fooled. He knew I was the one who had called. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my front door. Slow, deliberate scratches, like someone dragging their fingernails down the wood. I sat frozen in my bed, clutching a baseball bat, waiting for the door to burst open, but it didn't. The scratching eventually stopped. The next day, I decided I couldn't live there anymore. I started packing, but before I could even finish, the cops came back. This time, they had a warrant. What they found inside Jerry's apartment still makes me sick to think about. In his freezer were several bags of meat. At first, the officers thought it was just beef or pork, but tests later confirmed it wasn't. It was human. In the basement storage unit he rented, they found something even worse: a small, makeshift operating table, blood-stained tools, and evidence of at least 3 different people who had gone missing in the area over the last year. And in the corner of the storage room, tied up and barely alive, was a woman. She had been missing for weeks. Jerry had kept her down there, starving her, torturing her. She could barely speak, but she was alive. The police arrested him on the spot. I'll never forget the way he looked at me as they dragged him out in handcuffs. His smile was gone. Instead, his eyes were cold, empty, full of hatred. Later, I found out that Jerry had a history. Years ago, he had been investigated for stalking and harassment, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. He moved from place to place, always blending in, always playing the role of the friendly neighbor, and behind closed doors, he was a monster. It chills me to think about how close I came to being one of his victims. He had a key. He had been in my apartment multiple times. He had watched me sleep. The police told me I was lucky. If I hadn't reported him when I did, I might have been his next meal. I moved out that same month, found a new place across town, in a building with cameras, locks, and a landlord who actually cares. But no matter how secure it is, I'll never feel fully safe again. Because sometimes the people who seem the friendliest, the ones who live right next door, are the ones you should fear the most. And I'll never forget Jerry. I've lived in plenty of apartments in my life, but none of them ever truly felt like home. You know that feeling when the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbors sneeze, or when every creak in the ceiling makes you wonder if the building is about to collapse? That was pretty much the norm for me, but nothing prepared me for what happened when I moved into the Maplewood apartments 2 years ago. At first glance, the place was unremarkable. 3 floors, peeling paint, rust on the balconies, and a faint smell of mold in the hallways. But it was cheap, and at 25 years old, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I signed a lease, moved in my few belongings, and figured I'd deal with whatever quirks the place had. The quirks showed up fast. Specifically, the noise. It came from the apartment right next to mine. The first night I slept there, I woke up at around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of banging. Not just a random thump or two, but a steady rhythmic thump, 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 like someone pounding a fist against the wall in time with a heartbeat. I sat up in bed, half asleep, annoyed more than anything else. "Great," I muttered. "I've got party neighbors." But it didn't sound like a party. There were no voices, no music, just that relentless pounding. After a few minutes, it stopped, and I managed to fall back asleep. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same sound. This time, though, I put my ear to the wall. That's when I heard something else. Muffled voices. Not a conversation exactly, more like crying. Soft, broken sobs that seemed to come from deep inside the wall itself. I pulled away, heart racing. Maybe I was imagining it. Old buildings make weird noises, right? Pipes groaning, wood shifting. That had to be it, but I couldn't shake the sound of that crying. It was too human, too real. Over the next week, the noises continued, always at night. Always the same rhythm. Sometimes it was the pounding, sometimes it was the crying, and sometimes it was something worse. One night, I heard a scream, short, sharp, cut off mid-breath. I froze in bed, staring at the wall, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't, just silence. Dead silence, heavier than before. I finally asked the landlord about it. He was an older guy named Frank, balding, with nicotine-stained fingers. "Hey," I said casually, "what's up with the neighbor next door? They're kind of loud at night." Frank frowned, rubbed his chin, and shook his head. "Nobody lives there." I blinked. "What do you mean? Someone has to live there. I hear them every night." "No," he said firmly. "That unit's been empty for months. Water damage. Can't rent it out until it's fixed. Nobody's in there." I laughed awkwardly, waiting for him to crack a smile, but he didn't. He just looked at me like I was wasting his time, then walked off. I should have left it alone. I should have just packed my things and broken the lease. But I couldn't, because the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. One night around 3 a.m., I was lying in bed when I heard the banging start again. This time, it was louder than ever, shaking the wall like someone was trying to break through. I pressed my ear against it and nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a voice. "Help me." It was faint, barely a whisper. But it was there. A man's voice, desperate, pleading. My heart hammered in my chest. I backed away from the wall, staring at it like it might open up at any second. After a few minutes, the noise stopped again, but I couldn't unhear that voice. The next day, I tried to get into the apartment. The door was locked, of course, and when I peeked through the little window by the hall, all I saw was darkness. No furniture, no lights, nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in there. I set up my phone against the wall that night, recording for hours while I tried to sleep. When I listened back the next morning, my blood went cold. At first it was just the banging, faint but steady. Then came the crying. And then at 3:12 a.m., clear as day, a voice whispered, "I see you." I dropped the phone in shock. That wasn't coming from the other side of the wall. That was directed at me. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. I stayed up with every light on, baseball bat in hand, staring at the wall. The noises didn't come those nights, almost like whoever, or whatever, was inside knew I was waiting. On the 3rd night, exhaustion got the better of me. I dozed off, bat clutched to my chest. I woke up to a new sound. Not banging, not crying, but scratching. Long, slow scratches dragging down the length of the wall. They started at the ceiling and worked their way down like fingernails clawing for a way out. And then I heard it, the voice again. Open the door. That was it. I called the police. When they arrived, I explained everything. The noises, the voices, the recordings. I could tell they didn't believe me, but to shut me up, they agreed to check out the vacant apartment. I waited in the hallway while they unlocked the door. The first thing that hit us was the smell. Rotten, thick, overwhelming. The cops gagged, pulled flashlights from their belts, and stepped inside. I stayed back, covering my nose with my shirt, but I couldn't help peeking in. The place looked abandoned, dust everywhere, mold on the walls. But in the living room, there was a large section of carpet that looked darker, stained. The smell was stronger there. One of the cops pulled out a knife and cut a square in the carpet. Beneath it, the wood floor was soaked through with something brownish black. Blood. That's when I heard one of them shout from the bedroom, "Found something!" I crept closer, heart pounding, and peeked inside. Against the far wall was a large, crudely built wooden box. It was padlocked shut. The smell coming from it was unbearable. They pried it open with a crowbar. Inside was a body, or what was left of one. The corpse was badly decomposed, skin sloughing off, eyes gone. The wrists were raw, like they'd been bound for a long time. And on the inside of the box's lid, deep scratches etched into the wood spelled out 2 words, "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly puking. The cops immediately called it in, and within an hour, the building was swarming with investigators. They sealed off the unit, interviewed me, and promised to figure out what happened. Turns out, the tenant who lived there before me, a man named David, had gone missing 6 months earlier. He was last seen entering the building, but never left. The landlord claimed he thought David had just skipped out on rent. Nobody ever checked the apartment thoroughly. The worst part? The medical examiner determined David had been alive for weeks inside that box before he died. Starving, trapped, pounding on the walls, crying for help. I had been hearing his final moments echo through those thin walls. The noises stopped after that. The apartment stayed sealed off for investigation, and eventually, the landlord was forced to sell the whole building. I moved out shortly after, unable to handle the memories. To this day, I can't sleep in silence. I keep a fan running, music playing, anything to drown out the quiet. Because sometimes when it gets too quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That faint rhythmic thump, 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 and the voice whispering, "Help me." When I signed the lease for that old townhouse, I thought I was getting a good deal. 2 stories, decent rent, and even a small basement for storage. The neighborhood wasn't great, but I was used to that. I just needed a roof over my head while I worked 2 jobs to pay off my student loans. At first, everything was fine. The place was old, yeah, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but nothing I couldn't handle. The only odd thing was my next-door neighbor. His name was Carl. Carl was in his late 50s, tall, with greasy gray hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. The first time we met, he barely spoke, just nodded once and went back inside. He wasn't the friendly type, which was fine by me. I preferred to be left alone anyway. But within the first week, I noticed something strange. At night, when everything was quiet, I'd hear scratching. Faint at first, like a mouse in the walls. But it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the basement. I brushed it off, told myself it was probably just rodents. The house was old, it made sense. But the scratching got louder, more frantic, and sometimes, in between, I swore I could hear muffled noises, like whispers. One night, I grabbed a flashlight and went down to check. The basement was small and damp, mostly empty, except for some old shelves and a rusty furnace. I scanned every corner, but saw nothing, just cobwebs and dust. Still, the noises kept happening, always at night, always from down below. Then I realized something. The sound wasn't coming from my basement. It was coming from the other side of the wall, Carl's basement. That made sense, right? Thin walls, sound carrying through. But the more I listened, the more wrong it felt. The noises weren't just scratching. Sometimes they were more like banging, and sometimes late at night I'd hear something else, screaming. Not loud, muted, like someone trying to scream with their mouth covered. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress from work, lack of sleep, overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something was off about Carl. The next time I saw him, I couldn't stop staring. His clothes always looked stained, like he'd been working on something messy. He had deep bags under his eyes, like he never slept. and when he caught me looking, he gave me this smile. Not a friendly smile, a knowing one. That night, the noises came back stronger than ever. Scratching, banging, crying. I sat in bed, trembling, clutching my phone. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I say? My neighbor's making weird noises in his basement? They'd laugh at me. So I decided to record it. I set my phone against the basement wall, hit record, and left it overnight. The next morning, I listened. At first, it was just the usual scratching and banging. But then, around 2:45 a.m., I heard it. A voice. Please, let me out. My blood ran cold. That wasn't an animal. That wasn't pipes. That was a person. I called the police immediately. They came out, listened to the recording, and agreed it was suspicious. They went next door, knocked on Carl's door. He answered, calm as ever, and let them in. I stood outside, heart racing, waiting. After about 15 minutes, the cops came back out. They said they didn't find anything. Carl claimed he'd been working with tools in the basement, explained the noises away as DIY repairs. They apologized for the inconvenience and left. Carl stood in his doorway, watching me. That smile was back. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every sound, I jumped out of my skin. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, but this time it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the vents. I froze, listening. A voice, faint but clear, drifted through the ductwork. He's gonna kill me. I didn't hesitate. I called 911 again, begging them to come back. They showed up reluctantly, clearly annoyed, but when I insisted they check the basement this time, they finally agreed. Carl argued at first, but when they threatened to get a warrant, he backed down. They unlocked the basement door and went down. I'll never forget the sound that followed. One of the officers shouted, "Oh my God." The other yelled for backup. I crept to the doorway, peeking in, and what I saw will haunt me forever. The basement wasn't empty like mine. It was a nightmare. Chains hung from the ceiling, bloodstains smeared across the floor. Against one wall was a filthy mattress, soaked through with dark stains, and in the far corner, chained to the pipes, was a young woman, thin, pale, bruised, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't alone. Next to her were two large coolers. The cops opened them and immediately gagged. Inside were severed body parts, arms, legs, wrapped in plastic, stacked like leftovers. Carl was arrested on the spot. He didn't resist. In fact, he just smiled as they cuffed him, like he knew this was coming all along. The woman survived, thank God. She'd been missing for weeks. She told police Carl had lured her into his house, drugged her, and kept her in the basement. She also said she wasn't the first. Investigators believe Carl had been doing this for years. He would kidnap people, torture them, and when he was finished, dismember them and store the parts in those coolers. The scratching and banging I'd been hearing were his victims, desperately trying to get out. And the voices, they weren't in my head. They were real. After the arrest, I moved out immediately. I couldn't stand being in that house another second. But even now, in my new apartment, I still hear it sometimes. That faint scratching in the walls, that desperate whisper, "Please, let me out." When I signed the lease for that duplex, I thought I had finally found peace. After years of cramped apartments, noisy roommates, and paper-thin walls, the quiet little place on the edge of town felt like paradise. It wasn't much, but for me it was everything. My own space, no one above me stomping at 2 a.m., no constant revolving door of strangers in the hallways. Just me, my things, and a single neighbor who lived on the other side of the wall. His name was Tom. Tom introduced himself on the day I moved in. He was in his mid-30s, stocky, with neatly trimmed brown hair, glasses, and a smile that looked a little too rehearsed. He walked over as I was unloading boxes from my car, holding a six-pack of beer like it was an olive branch. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said warmly. "I'm Tom. If you need anything, I'm right next door." He seemed harmless, friendly even. I thanked him, took the beer, and figured that was the end of it. I didn't want to be rude, but I also wasn't looking to become best friends with the guy. I was working long hours, trying to keep up with bills, and all I wanted was some peace and quiet. The first couple of weeks went by without incident. Tom was always around, though, always waving when I came home, always asking how my day was going when I grabbed the mail. He'd lingered just a little too long in conversation, even when I gave short answers. At first, I chalked it up to him being lonely. But soon, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. The first was the note. I found it tucked under my doormat one morning, a small square of paper with neat handwriting. "You looked really beautiful last night." I stood there on my porch, staring at the words, my stomach twisting. I lived alone. I hadn't had anyone over. The only person who could have written that was Tom. I crumpled the note and threw it away, telling myself it was a dumb joke, or maybe even meant for someone else. But deep down, I knew. A few nights later, I was changing into my pajamas when I noticed something strange. A faint red dot moved across my blinds. I froze. At first, I thought it was a laser pointer, but then the dot hovered, steadied, and I realized it was the beam of a camera. Someone was watching me. I yanked the curtains shut, heart pounding. The next morning, there was another note under my mat. "You should wear the blue pajamas again." I felt sick. He hadn't just been outside my window. He had been close enough to see what I was wearing. From that day on, I avoided Tom as much as possible. No more small talk, no more waves. But he didn't stop. In fact, he seemed to enjoy it more when I ignored him. I'd come home late from work and catch him standing in his yard, staring at my windows. Sometimes he'd smile and wave. Other times, he'd just stand there in the dark, motionless, his eyes locked on me. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overreacting. But then it escalated. One night, I came home to find my front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it that morning. I stepped inside cautiously, checking every room. Everything looked normal, until I went into my bedroom. On my pillow was a single Polaroid photo. It was me, asleep in that very bed. I dropped the picture, my hands trembling. He had been inside my house. He had stood over me while I slept and taken that picture. I called the police immediately. They came, looked around, but found no signs of forced entry. They questioned Tom, but he denied everything. Without evidence, there was nothing they could do. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. The faint, deliberate sound of my doorknob turning. I grabbed my phone and whispered to 911, telling them someone was trying to get in. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line. I crept to the living room, heart hammering, and that's when I saw him. Tom. He was standing in my house. He had a knife in one hand and a camera in the other. His smile was wider than I'd ever seen, his glasses glinting in the dim light. I screamed into the phone. Tom froze, his expression changing instantly from glee to rage. He lunged toward me, but the sound of approaching sirens made him stop. He bolted out the back door, disappearing into the night. The police caught him 2 blocks away. He still had the knife and camera on him, but the nightmare didn't end there. When they searched his house, what they found was worse than anything I could have imagined. In his basement was a room. The walls were covered in photos of me, hundreds of them. Some taken through my windows, some while I was at work, some while I was sleeping. He had items of mine too. Clothes, underwear, my toothbrush, even strands of my hair taped to the wall like trophies. And then there was the journal, page after page of detailed plans. How he had been watching me since the day I moved in. How he was going to make me his. How he wanted to keep me locked in that basement room, just like the others. Because I wasn't the first. In a locked cabinet, the police found hard drives, each filled with photos and videos of women just like me. Women who had lived next door to him in different places. Women who had disappeared. Some of the footage showed them alive, tied up, begging for help. Other footage I couldn't even watch. The police believed Tom had been doing this for years, moving from place to place, luring women into his web. I had just been the latest target. Tom is in prison now, serving multiple life sentences. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but I'll never forget that night, waking up to find him standing in my living room, knife in hand, camera ready. The look in his eyes when he saw me, like I was an object he already owned. I thought neighbors were supposed to look out for each other, not hunt each other. When I first saw the house, I couldn't believe the price. A 3-bedroom home with a basement, yard, and garage for less than what I used to pay for a dingy apartment? It felt like a dream. The landlord, a man in his 50s named Gerald, seemed eager to have it rented. He smiled too much, talked too fast, and kept trying to usher me through the tour quickly. But one thing stood out. In the basement, there was a heavy door tucked into the far wall. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was thick, solid wood reinforced with 3 separate padlocks. When I asked about it, Gerald laughed nervously and said, "Storage. Belonged to the previous owner. Don't worry about it." At the time, I didn't press. Everyone has quirks, right? Maybe he had old junk down there. Maybe the locks were just to keep renters from messing with things. I brushed it off, signed the lease, and moved in. For the first 2 weeks, life was normal, peaceful, even. The neighborhood was quiet. My closest neighbor was an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker, and I finally felt like I had my own space. But that door kept gnawing at me. Every time I went down to do laundry, I'd see those padlocks and feel a strange pull. Why would a landlord rent a house and keep part of it locked up like that? The first time I heard the noise, I was half asleep. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain lashes the windows and thunder shakes the walls. The power flickered, and I went downstairs with a flashlight to check the breaker. That's when I heard it, faint scratching coming from behind the locked door. I froze. My first thought was rats, but the scratching stopped. Then came something worse. A whisper, muffled, weak, but unmistakably human. "Help me." My blood ran cold. I stood there, every instinct screaming to run. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Please, let me out." I bolted upstairs and slammed the basement door, locking it behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Old houses make noises, pipes creak, wind howls. But when I went back downstairs the next day, something was different. The padlocks. They weren't in the same order. Someone had been messing with them. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into work, avoided the basement unless absolutely necessary. But the noises continued, sometimes scratching, sometimes faint knocks, sometimes whispers that made my skin crawl. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, Mrs. Parker called out to me from her porch. "You live in the old Miller place now, don't you?" she said. "Yeah," I answered. Her face hardened. "Did he tell you about the room?" I froze. My mouth went dry. "What room?" Her eyes shifted toward my basement window. "Be careful, dear. Some doors should stay shut." I laughed nervously and tried to brush it off, but her words burrowed into my brain. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I sat in bed, heart pounding, listening to the faint sound of someone knocking. Not frantic, just steady. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 knocks again. Finally, I snapped. I had to know. The next day, I bought a pair of bolt cutters. I waited until midnight, when the neighborhood was quiet, and crept down into the basement. My hands shook as I cut through the first lock, then the second, then the third. The final lock clattered to the floor. I hesitated, heart racing. The air around the door felt heavy, cold. Slowly, I pulled it open. The stench hit me immediately. Rot, mildew, something metallic underneath it all. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow concrete room. Chains hung from the walls. A stained mattress lay in the corner. And the walls, they were covered in scratches, hundreds of them. Fingernail marks gouged deep into the concrete. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was a corpse. A figure crouched in the far corner, hair matted, skin pale and sunken. But then she moved. Her head lifted, and her eyes met mine, wide, wild, and desperate. "Don't let him put me back," she whispered. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. Before I could say anything, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. I spun around, and there was Gerald, my landlord. Only he didn't look like the friendly man who'd shown me the house. His smile was gone, replaced by a twisted snarl. In his hand was a hammer, the metal head glinting in the flashlight beam. "You weren't supposed to open it," he hissed. Time slowed. He raised the hammer, and instinct took over. I swung the flashlight at his face, the plastic cracking against his temple. He grunted, stumbling, and the woman screamed, launching herself at him from behind. The 3 of us crashed to the basement floor in a tangle of limbs. Gerald roared in fury, slamming the hammer against the concrete, barely missing my head. I scrambled for the crowbar I'd brought with me and swung with everything I had. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet crack. Gerald collapsed, blood spilling across the basement floor. He twitched once, then went still. Silence. The woman sobbed, clutching her head in her hands, rocking back and forth. "Thank you," she whispered over and over. "Thank you." I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. What followed still haunts me. The woman had been missing for months. Gerald had abducted her and kept her locked in that room, feeding her just enough to keep her alive. She wasn't his first victim. When the police searched the basement, they found evidence. DNA, blood, personal belongings that tied him to at least 3 other women who had disappeared over the years. Some of them hadn't survived. The house became a crime scene. Reporters swarmed the street. Mrs. Parker watched from her porch, her sharp blue eyes filled with sorrow but not surprise. Later I learned she had lived next to Gerald for decades. She'd always suspected something was wrong, but never had proof. I sold the house within weeks. I couldn't bear to step foot inside again. Sometimes at night, though, I still hear it in my dreams, that faint scratching, those whispers through the wall. And I wake up wondering how many others had begged for help, their voices lost behind that locked door.